Hello, everyone. A friend of mine sent me this Instagram reel about wearing sunscreen on airplanes, and I thought it was a great example of how the popular press and, in fact, many doctors do a very bad job of overinterpreting scientific literature. And so I thought I'd go over with you guys and explain to you how this is being misinterpreted. All right, so let's watch this reel.
It's time for my third annual reminder of why you should always wear sunscreen when you're on a plane. A study on cabin and flight crews found that
Okay, we'll pause this. This is the paper that's cited by every single person talking about this in every article. This is a paper out of JAMA Dermatology in 2015. It's called The Risk of Melanoma in Pilots and Cabin Crew, UV Measurements in Flying Airplanes. Okay, so we're going to go over this paper pretty clearly, but this is the paper that's cited by everyone.
due to the amount of UVA rays plane windows let in, which cause long-term sun damage, an hour on a plane at normal flight altitudes is equivalent to about 20 minutes in a tanning bed. And since this is my third year sharing this exact tip, I'm going to preempt some comments I know are coming. First, yes, shutting your window helps reduce exposure, but you can't control the rest of the cabin. If the people in front of you, behind you, or across the aisle from you have their windows open, you're exposed. And second, no, plane windows are not made of glass. Here are some of my
That's a funny thing because we'll go over how being made of glass is actually worse. Being made of plastic is actually better for UV.
travel size favorites. I usually apply a cream
Okay, then she talks about how she puts on sunscreen. Okay, and then this is a dermatologist who's on TikTok, and again, citing this research study in JAMA Dermatology from 2015 says, when you learn that pilots have 2 times the incidence of melanoma and you should absolutely wear sunscreen on airplanes or keep the window shut. A study found that flying in the cockpit for 56 minutes at 30,000 feet receives the same amount of UV radiation as 20 minutes in a tanning bed session. Okay, that's the same thing that the Instagram influencer before said. Even more UVA is reflected when flying over thick clouds and snow. Windows do not block UVB, but not UVA. Okay, so this is not entirely true. And then there is a bunch of articles why you should wear sunscreen on a plane. And if you look at this, they also talk about the study that says 56 minutes in the cockpit of a plane yielded the same amount of radiation as 20 minutes in a tanning bed. They love this study. They keep talking about it over and over again. Here's another one. Do I need to wear sunscreen on a plane? And okay, in fact, the study of UV radiation showed that flying at 30 can be equivalent to a 20-minute tanning bed session. So same paper. And here's another one. Why you should wear sunscreen on a plane and other travel skincare. And then if you look at this, I think they quote that same paper again. Okay, this one does not quote the paper, but they're talking about it. Okay, yeah, here's another one. Conte Nast Traveler. So same thing, yeah. A recent study in JAMA Dermatology found that 1 hour at 30,000 feet is the same as 20 minutes on a tanning bed session. Wow, they love that quote. They keep talking about that over again. Okay, so here is the paper. This is the paper. Risk of melanoma in pilots and cabin crew and UV measurements in flying airplanes. This is a paper out of UC San Francisco, which is a great institution. It's a good paper. There's nothing wrong with the paper. It's just the way that it's interpreted. The way that you need to look at these papers and figure out how they did the study. So you go straight to the methods, and what they did is they used a UV measurement device, makes sense, and they measured the UV radiation in the pilot seat inside a general aviation turboprop airplane, the Socata TBM 850, through the acrylic plastic windshield at ground level. So they measured at ground level and at these various feet above sea level. They were measured in 2 different locations, San Jose and Las Vegas. So these are obviously high solar radiation places. Around midday in April. So this is the highest, you could have done it in the summer, which would give probably even more. But in the Northern Hemisphere, April, May, that's pretty high radiation. And then they were also used the meters to measure the UV radiation in a tanning bed. Okay, so that's what they did. Now, you'll notice what they did not measure it in. They did not measure it in the passenger compartment of a commercial airliner. So this is what a Socata TBM 850 looks like. This is a Socata TBM airplane. This is a propeller business plane, and they measured in the cockpit of this plane. So you're measuring what the UV radiation in the cockpit of this specific plane is. And the other thing that they say is that it's the same amount of radiation from that area as in the cockpit as in a tanning bed. That makes you think that it's similar? No, it's because when you go into a tanning bed, you take off all your clothes or almost all of your clothes. You're trying to get a tan, and you expose your whole body to that radiation. When pilots are flying, they are usually not naked while they're flying. Their face is uncovered, their hands are uncovered, pretty much everything else is covered. So the amount of radiation they're getting, the exposed to is the same, but they're wearing clothing. So the amount of they're exposed to the same, but what the body sees is very little. It's just their face and their hands. Okay, so why was this study done? It is because it is well known that the risk of melanoma in airline pilots and cabin crew is higher. So this is a paper done by the same people that did this study. So you'll notice this is uh, Martina San Lorenzo, and this is Martina San Lorenzo, same group. And they did a meta-analysis that's like looking at lots of papers in the past, and they find out that the incidence rate, so the chances that a pilot gets melanoma is 2.2 times higher than the general population, and for cabin crew, it's 2.1 times higher. So it's pretty similar between cabin crew and pilots, and it is twice as high as the general population. That is a significant difference. It's 100% higher. And then another meta-analysis says the same thing. This is a different group. They did the same meta-analysis, and they also found similar that the incidence ratio was about 2 times higher for both pilots. Um, and then in their meta-analysis, it was a little bit higher in the cabin crew than in the pilots. And so they say evidence shows that airline pilots and cabin crew are about twice the risk of melanoma and other skin cancers. So in this one, they looked at melanoma and other skin cancers. In the other one, they just looked at melanoma. But see, however, most of this meta-analysis was from stuff done decades ago, and the relevance to contemporary levels of risk is uncertain because planes have changed in the last several decades. The materials used is different, and we understand that these are the risks. And so planes are being designed to mitigate some of these risks. The other thing that's interesting is if you look at pilots and cabin crew, you know that the radiation that the pilots get is going to be much higher than the cabin crew. So here is what the cabin crew and you as a passenger see. You're in a relatively dark cabin. There's windows on the side. The windows are pretty small, and most of the time, a lot of times they're lowered. Um, but the amount of sunlight you're getting in the cabin as a cabin crew member and as a passenger is relatively small compared to this. This is what the pilot sees. The pilots are in a cockpit that's full of windows because you want them to see very, very well. Um, and so here's the visor that they use. This thing blocks all UVA and UVB radiation. So it's interesting that in the analysis that cabin crew and pilots have very similar risks, which kind of makes you think that it's maybe not the UV radiation because the amount of UV radiation exposure that the pilots and the cabin crew get are probably a little bit different. Another type of radiation that they get is, so this is cancer incidence among fighter pilots. Fighter pilots do have a higher rate of developing testicular melanoma skin and prostate cancer. Um, and so if you look at this, we know that the higher you up in the atmosphere, you get exposed to more cosmic radiation, which is gamma rays and X-rays. And there's no way to mitigate exposure to gamma rays and X-rays. They go right through steel, glass, they go through everything. And so you're going to get exposed to that. And as a passenger, you will also get exposed to that. And a one a transcontinental flight increases the average exposure to radiation by about 5%. So if you take 20 long haul flights, you're probably doubling your baseline radiation exposure to your body from cosmic radiation and gamma rays and stuff. And so the baseline is quite low, so you can get many times your baseline and you're probably safe. But so pilots, as flight attendants, are actually tracked. They track how much radiation they get. It's part of their job safety for cosmic radiation and X-rays. Okay, so let's look at other um, other follow-up papers that looked at UV radiation exposure, going back to the radiation exposure, the UV radiation exposure. So this is the original paper from 2015 that looked at UV radiation. Again, all of these studies are in pilots because pilots have exposure like this, and everyone else has exposure like this. So everyone's very interested in the pilots because the pilots are going to have way higher exposure risk than anyone else. So they're all the ones that are in pilots. This is a study in 2020, and this one, instead of looking at a single airplane, which is uh, this airplane, which basically none of us fly. There's very few people that fly this thing, and the people that fly this thing know that they're flying this thing. Everyone else flies commercial jets, and this is looking at 322 short-haul flights in Airbus 320s and 321s, mostly out of Europe, and they looked at UVA and UVB dosages, and here's their results. For most flights, UVA exposure was also low. On 27 single sector flights, UV exposure could have exceeded the guidelines if eye protection was not used. That means if this little visor thing was not used, it could have gone over on about a little less than 10% of the flights. But in most of the flights, UV exposure was very, very low. And then this one also did a similar thing where they looked at a bunch of different flights, 14 flights from July to October in 2016. They looked at UV radiations A, B, and C. They did not find any UVC. They did not find UVA or UVB in the cabins of the planes tested. So on these 40 flights, they found no UVA or UVB in the cabin. So if you're sitting here, you got zero exposure. And then they did find on Boeing 777s that in the cockpit of the Boeing 777s, they had UVA levels, but they remained well below the values found at ground level. If you were just out on the ground on a sunny day, it was less than that in the cockpit. And was also strongly reduced by more than 10 times by the cockpit visor. So basically, they found very, very low UVA radiation. This is another paper, and they looked at a bunch of flights, 312 flights, and on less than 5% of them, UVA exposure could have exceeded if sunglasses or visors had not been deployed. So this is in the cockpit again. Okay, a little background in case you guys don't know what they're talking about with UVA or UVB. This is visible light, so red is the highest wavelength, and then violet is the lowest wavelength. If you go past violet, that's why they called it ultraviolet, it becomes not visible to our eyes, and it's called UVA. This is the longest wavelength. This has less cancer risk than UVB. UVB is higher frequency, smaller wavelength, that has higher energy. And causes direct DNA damage. Now, UVA is also carcinogenic, but does not cause direct DNA damage. It causes free radicals in your system. It does penetrate a little deeper. It goes into the dermis of the skin because it's longer wavelength. It has higher penetration a little bit. And then UVC is the highest energy UV, but this gets blocked out by our atmosphere very, very easily. So unless you're out in space, you're not going to get exposed to this. And if you look at this is the whole electromagnetic spectrum. Here's the visible spectrum, and here's ultraviolet. If you go past ultraviolet, you get to X-rays and gamma rays. These are the cosmic rays that go right through airplanes, and you cannot avoid exposure to these if you fly. And you also get exposed to this on the ground, but at a lower level because the atmosphere does absorb some of this radiation. All right, so this is another one talking about measurement of UV radiation in commercial aircraft. They did not find much. If you look at this, and you'll see that glass has the worst. Okay, look at this. So glass versus plastic. If you look at this is the UV. Here's plastic in the dark diamonds. See, it blocks all UVB and most of UVA, and then because UVA stops at 400, right? So it blocks most UVA, whereas glass is worse. And if it was pure glass, this is laminated glass. Pure glass is even worse. Pure glass transmits almost all UV radiation. So glass is actually worse for UV transmission. If you want to stop UV transmission, glass is the absolute worst. Plastic is better, which is funny that influencer was talking about how the cabin windows are plastic and not glass. If it was glass, indeed would be worse, and you probably should use some kind of protection. What commercial airline cabin windows are made from? They're made from something called stretched acrylic, and here's a company that makes stretched acrylic for cabins. And if you look at this, if you look at their data sheet for uh, for UV transmittance, they are well aware of this, and almost all the manufacturers are well aware of this UV issue. They're trying to block it. It's pretty easy to do, so they can easily block it. And you see here's their in the red, completely blocks UVA and UVB, transmits visible light, and then it blocks some infrared radiation as well. So that is what's going on. So yeah, I find it funny that basically they keep referencing this one study back from 2015 that was done in the cockpit of this plane, and trying to extrapolate that information to being in this kind of plane in the cabin. All subsequent studies of the cockpit of commercial airlines have found very small amounts of UVA radiation, except in Boeing 777s and probably a few other liners, but that's completely mitigated by the use of the sun visor, which blocks like 10 times, about 10 times more protection than the windshield. And now that they know about this, they're making these windshields as well more UV protective for UVA as well. They have to kind of balance that with the optical qualities. They want pilots to be able to see very well. But in the cabin, they are basically making things that block the UVB completely. So yeah, they just need to look at the materials and methods and know how did they get this data. They did not get this data from looking in the cabin of commercial airliners. They're looking at the cockpit of a small propeller airplane and trying to extrapolate that to the cabin of commercial jetliners, which makes no sense. And then this thing about comparing it to a tanning bed, you're like assuming that people are naked in the cockpit of this propeller plane, which is, I mean, maybe it's happened, but it's not what usually happens in the cockpit of propeller airplanes. Okay, so when you guys see this kind of stuff in the popular press, just understand that they do a pretty bad job uh, of extrapolating the data to the actual use case. They kind of overinterpret it, and that's a very common thing that the popular press does with scientific literature. They find something that's very interesting, like this whole 60 minutes in an airplane is the same as 20 minutes in a tanning bed, is a really good soundbite, and so they love to do that, and they put that in there as if it is true, but it's true in that would be a true statement if you followed this paper. If you're in the cockpit of this airplane completely naked at 20,000 feet, yes, an hour in that airplane in that condition is the same as a tanning bed. But you cannot extrapolate that to someone that's in a totally different plane with a totally different kind of windshield, with totally different amounts of exposure in people that are fully clothed in the cabin of a plane. And then all subsequent studies found very little exposure to both UVB and UVA. So do you need to wear sunscreen? No. Does it really hurt if you do? No, probably not. You're probably fine. A lot of people do it, and you're probably not hurting yourself if you're wearing sunscreen on the plane. At least not any more than just wearing sunscreen does overall. But it's not like you're getting more exposure on an airplane than you are just being in your car on the ground or in your house. All right, hope that's clear to you guys. Thanks for watching.